Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. As usual, I am your host, Munro, and today I have with me Dr. Jon Gruda, who is the Assistant Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Maynooth University, which, for those of you that don't know, is the National University of Ireland. So welcome, Jon. Fabulous to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Hannah. Pleasure to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself, Jon. Like, what has been your journey, and what are some of the bits of research that you are working on at the moment?
Yeah, so my background is, my undergrad was in business, but then during my PhD, I found a love for psychology, so to speak, and so I did a joint PhD in management and in psychology in both France and Germany, and then moved to Ireland about 5 years ago. And in terms of research, it's been mostly focused on leadership and the role that leaders play when it comes to the relationships they have with their followers, and what that means with regard to change management, what that means with regard to going through a crisis together, and simply, how do we appear as leaders to our followers is something that seems to be very important to leaders, and it's something that's been very important to myself in my research as well.
No, absolutely. I think during COVID, I think the need for good and strong leadership has just become more and more apparent, but obviously a lot more challenging. So tell us a little bit about what does a healthy leader, and I'll use the term follower, because I think, what does it look? What does a good relationship look like?
So, like any other relationship that you might think of in life, with maybe a friend or a significant other, the relationship is only healthy when both parties feel that they're being supported, when both parties feel that they are being heard, and that their concerns are validated by the other person. Not necessarily agreed upon. I mean, you can disagree, that's fine. But when I come to my leader, I do want that person to listen to me. I want that person to take me seriously, and so that is a very very basic expectation of what constitutes a good or a healthy relationship. But leadership is complex, so it's much more than that as well. This is the bare minimum. But also we expect leaders, our authority figures in the workplace, to really not only be supportive but also show us the way, guide us, direct us, and to some degree also inspire us. And that is something that has to do with motivation, has to do with well-being. So it's a cascading set of consequences that leader and leader behaviors tend to give to followers.
And is there I'm going slightly off topic, and my listeners will tell you I do a lot. Is there a hierarchy, like Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Is there a hierarchy of levels of leadership that you have where you sort of, this is the basis and then it moves its way up the train?
So we can talk about Maslow's hierarchy as well. Interesting, bits there that people don't tend to know about. But to answer your question, it's a very, very contentious matter in the research to say that, we did some research, we looked at leaders and we looked at followers, and who were your leaders? Well, it was these people's supervisor. That's not necessarily the definition of a leader. So I don't want to be I don't want in my own research, but also many of my colleagues share that as well, to be stuck with the definition of who has power, who has authority, who has access to resource. That's a leader. That's not a leader. A leader is somebody that I consider to be a leader. So if my supervisor is not that to me, then this is not somebody that I see as my leader. This will not be somebody that I go to for advice, for direction. So it doesn't have to be constrained to hierarchy. You can have a leader who is on your level. You can have a peer, somebody that you trust, a trusted colleague, a respected colleague. That is somebody that you can, oftentimes if I ask you to describe this person, they come up with characteristics that we would normally attribute to leaders. And then I would ask the same person, well, describe your supervisor, and it's not always the same. So your supervisor can certainly be your leader. A manager can be a leader, but just because you're a manager doesn't make you automatically a leader.
So that's a really interesting concept, isn't it? So what you said, those characteristics of leadership. So tell us about what those characteristics of leadership are.
So this has been a question that we've been trying to answer for over a century. So the history, so to speak, of leadership, it all started with this idea that there's a list of traits. So it's trait theory. But if you can just get this list of traits down on paper that we all as a society agree upon, these are the characteristics that make a leader, we can just agree that, okay, so if we meet somebody, let's say we're interviewing somebody for a manager position, if they score 7 out of 10, like they tick 7 out of those 10 traits, let's say, they're automatically leader. It doesn't work like that. So that's a nice idea. It's very neat. It's very clean, but it doesn't work for many reasons. So one is because this list would be growing, infinitely. Like we come up with new words all the time, and so we would be constantly adding to this list of characteristics, which makes it seem really impossible. Like nobody can be all these things. But that's not even the most, critical aspect of this idea. But it's rather that your definition of a leader is very different from mine. Like I can guarantee you, it's gonna be different enough for both of us to meet the same person. All right. So let's assume we are both working together. We're in the same team, and a new team leader has been assigned to our team, as oftentimes happens, or a new CEO or a new CFO, right? And then we meet this person. Depending on what my definition is of a leader, what my mental image is of an ideal leader, which is a product of many, many different things. It's a product of my personality. It's a product of early socialization experiences. What prior leaders have I had in my life that you might not have had? Those will be the factors that influence my mental image of a leader. And let's assume this person, this new CFO, for example, resonates with me, that person seems to be similar enough in terms of behavior to, prior leaders that I've had, leaders that I deem to be ideal. Then I will say this is a leader. To you, it might be a very different story. So that's the idea of implicit leadership theory, that we really, each of us has an individually different picture of what an ideal leader should be like. So cannot answer the question.
But that's actually a really interesting answer, in that makes it even more challenging for a leader, particularly one going into a new role, to fit potentially multiple different profiles of each individual in the team.
Yeah.
So how, out of interest, is there been any research to say what people can do to help support that? And it is, I guess my question is it possible for a person to fit all of the profiles of leadership if they all have different views of what a leader looks like?
Yeah, so I would say that the number one factor that you can control as a leader is to get to know your team and to get them know as individuals first, and to get them know really well. So to make an active effort, not to just see it as you arrive at work, now we are at work and this is your work self and I don't care about anything else that's going on in your life, but rather to see the person as a whole, as a person. So, sharing experiences themselves. So if you self-disclose as a leader, that makes you seem more trustworthy in the eyes of others, because you're sharing vulnerability, basically. You're sharing something that you don't have to share, that you like a particular kind of music, or this is what you like to do on the weekends with the family, So things that are not work related at all can be very revealing about yourself. And that certainly at least builds a bridge of trust, that the other person says, oh, okay, so this is not just, a work person that I have to deal with, but this is a person. So, that opens up others to share themselves, and that's what builds, a relationship. And so over time, you start realizing, okay, so what is that's really important to this person, and where are some of the areas that I as a leader can improve in terms of meeting that person's expectations of what a leader should be like. But it's a continuous process. So it's not something that you do, you have one team meeting at the beginning of the year and, that's it. Like, we can all go home now. I know who you are and what you need as a follower. So it's a dedication and it's a commitment to really building long-lasting relationships, which is not easy to do. So it requires a lot of effort. Yeah.
Is there anything else along those lines that particularly those coming into a new role should be thinking about in terms of how to build that leader-follower relationship?
Well, I mean, if you can, it would be really good to have some prior information, so information about prior leaders that these individuals that you're about to lead now have been assigned to. What kind of teams were they working in? Who was their leader? Can we get a profile on that person? And a profile, I don't mean, where did they study and, how long have they been in the company, but rather, some behaviors, so ask other people, I'm about to start leading this team of 4 followers, let's say, I don't know anything about them, but before I start engaging with them, I can find out who was the person that was leading them before. If you can talk to that person directly, that's great. Find out more about them, see what kind of leader they were, and then see what the team said about that leader and whether that corresponded to their idea of what an ideal leader should be like. So essentially, do your homework if you can, and if you have that information, which is much more difficult if you're coming into the company from the outside. That's very difficult to do. But once you're there, or if you're being promoted, then you should have access to at least people that know this person and can tell you a little bit about how they tend to behave, or how would they describe this person. And we've shown that this is actually something that can be tested experimentally. So it is not something that relies too much on an actual leader. It can be a fictional leader as well.
So we talked a little there about sort of obviously getting access to what a previous leader was like. Is emulation always the right way to go? Perhaps they weren't a strong leader. How would you approach it if they've had perhaps a poor leader or certainly somebody that the team felt was a poor leader? How would you approach it in that scenario?
Right. Well, again, the question is whether or not you if you know that the prior leader was not seen as a good leader, I think it is just something that requires just very honesty and honest communication with the team, to meet with them and say, I know that your experiences with the prior leader have not been ideal, have not been what they should be, and so tell me what you would like to see for in somebody that is supposed to be leading you. It doesn't have to be you as in yourself to do this, but if you can find somebody that they trust, well-respected peer, somebody that's outside of that team, so not part of this team, but somebody that at least knows the team members, I think that can open up a channel of communication that they don't feel like they're saying anything that's like confidential and they're afraid to step on anyone's toes, but rather just having conversation with a colleague, and this is to improve the dynamics that we have within the team. I think that's something that anyone would appreciate at the very least. But you should be honest about it. So you should say that, okay, so I know that this has been the case. We want to do things better. So what are some of the aspects that you would like to see to see improving? And when you ask people that, they tend to focus on the just most important things, because there might be 100 things they don't like about the prior person, but they will focus on 2 or 3 things that can actually be addressed somehow. And then you have to do your very best as a leader, as a new leader, to try and address those as much as you can, as much as it's humanly possible, and also to communicate to everyone that this will take time. But you're here to stay. You're here to do this together with the team, and to see it as a conversation, as a not just, okay, so I told you what I want from you, now go off and do it, but rather, this has to be a relationship. It has to be dynamic.
And I guess a lot of that is people's perception of what they think a leader is and should be. How, out of interest, has there been any research on people's perception of what they think a leader is versus almost an unconscious assessment of whether somebody's a leader?
Yeah. So what's been done, and some of our own research has touched on this as well. So what we knew from quite some time ago is that there's a process called leader transference. So which is exactly described as you had a leader at some point, right? And you described this person. And now you are faced with a different leader, with a new leader. We're giving you a hypothetical scenario where we say, imagine your leader leaves the company, leaves the team, you're assigned a new leader. You don't know anything about this person, but somebody that you used to work with does. So you go to them and you ask them, can you tell me something about this new leader? Let's call the new leader Bob. Okay, just to have a name, just Bob from whatever department you like, right? And so you go to this colleague and you ask them, how would you describe Bob? Again, you know nothing about Bob. And they give you a list of traits. And essentially what that research found, and we used the same kind of experimental setup, was that if Bob reminds you of a prior leader, and if you had a good relationship with your prior leader, then you will expect to have a good relationship with Bob. if you had a bad relationship with your prior leader and Bob reminds you of this person, not in terms of what they look like, but in terms of how they behave, then you will also expect to have a bad relationship with Bob. You don't even know Bob. Bob doesn't even exist. Bob is a fictional person, right? And so we know that individuals tend to transfer past relationship, characteristics or quality and turn them into expectations when it comes to future relationships. We do this, by the way, a lot outside of work, but it also works very much inside of the workplace. So what we did in our research is we looked at, can we predict how strongly somebody is going to be engaging in this process of transferring past relationship to new relationship expectations, and we find we can actually predict it based on the relational traits of these individuals, of these followers. So depends on how much you relied on your prior leader. Maybe you were very anxious and you always needed your leader to be close by. If that's the case, you're likely going to expect to do that with a new leader as well. But if you're very self-reliant, independent, you just want to be left alone to do your work, then you're less likely to engage in this transference process. And then to make things even more complicated, then we looked at culture, and culture seems to play a big role. I mean, national culture seems to play a big role in terms of, what are our perceptions of leaders and how do we balance those when it comes to new leaders. And again, these were fictional people. Like, they know they're in an experiment. They know this is a fictional scenario. And it's really interesting to see that even in a fictional scenario, these prototypes are activated and people start transferring past relationships to new relationships. So that's really interesting. So a leader doesn't even have to be real for us to start engaging in that process and seeing them as a leader. And in our minds, okay, so Bob is now my leader. Bob doesn't exist, right? And we still find the same type of transference that you would see in when looking at actual leaders. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because it almost there's a point, isn't there, about how you set somebody new into role up for success. Because if you describe them and their behaviour is the same as the previous leader, those that had a good relationship would assume they're going to have a good relationship. Those that perhaps didn't would have that automatic assumption and almost like a barrier up. So there's an interesting perspective for those that are leading, that are always at the top end of the chain and bringing new leaders in, for how they actually describe that person as they come into the organization.
Yeah, so that's something that I think top management can do a better job at. Basically, if you want to try to minimize the potential fallout from you had a team, and of course, the more senior the team, the more drastic the consequences. So if you're looking at a top management team and you replace the CEO, you replace the CFO, right? You just throw this person into this new environment, and it's like, okay, well, hopefully this will work out better. But no, you can actually do a little bit more, like find out, how did these individuals in the team see that leader, see that, for example, CFO, right? And what kind of relationship did they have with that person? Is this new person very similar to that other person that left the firm? And if so, that might be an issue, because if the relationships weren't good before and you're showing them, look here, this is your 2.0, Bob 2.0, right? But it's still Bob, right? So it's like, to them at least. So they will just expect, okay, so this is going to be the same, of what we always knew. That's no change. And you're going to automatically have your wall up and say, I'm only going to be very super, super professional about this. I'm not going to be engaging with this person on anything that is not work related. And that makes it very difficult to build a relationship of trust, especially in the long term.
And you mentioned earlier that the expectations of leadership differ nationally. So by that, do you mean within each country? So
within each country, or within culture clusters. So there's been a lot of research done, some of it by my colleagues as well, to look at an international, can we get an international picture of what an ideal leader is like to employees all around the world. And this is some work that was done, I think, in 2004, which is called the Globe study, and they did find vast differences depending on how far you go culture-wise, that with regard to expectations what a leader should be like. So there certainly are differences if you compare, for example, Mexico and Germany and the Netherlands, or even the UK or Ireland, with regard to, flat hierarchy. Are you going to be in a team where, it doesn't matter what your hierarchy is? If you have an idea, it will be heard, it will be respected, it will be listened to. And that's very much a product of national culture as well. So in certain countries, this will never happen. Like, you won't feel comfortable sharing your idea. It wouldn't even occur to you that you're being asked to do this, because it's so far from, what the culture or norms dictate you to behave. So there's a large power distance. Whenever there's a large power distance between yourself and the leader or a authority figure, you're much less likely to be, perceived as, or to be perceiving yourself as somebody that, yeah, I can just share my opinion and I won't be, punished for it. This won't seem awkward to anybody. And we know that this is the case, and in some countries you can share your ideas freely and people will listen, right? And I'd say UK, Ireland, Netherlands, particularly as well, that's very much the case. Also from personal experience, and I lived in Netherlands. So, but in other countries like Germany, you don't have to go that far. You don't have to go all the way to Mexico. That is less likely to be the case. And so, there are certainly cultural differences, and whenever it comes to expectations of anything, perceptions of anything, culture plays a very big role.
And that's really interesting for those, because we work with a lot of CFOs that are leading global teams. So, like they'll have a team in the UK, a team in the US, a team in France or Germany. So where can people find out about what are almost the leadership expectations for the different countries that they're working with?
So I can provide a couple of links to a couple of dashboards. One of them, so the Globe study that I was talking about earlier, was based on work that was done by cross-cultural researcher Hofstede, and he passed away a few years ago. But he's done some incredible work in terms of looking at just cross-cultural differences, not leadership specifically. And then the Globe study builds on that. So I can provide a couple links to some more resources on that, and you can just literally check individual countries and look at what the expectations are, and see where you might fit in. I mean, just because you are born into a culture doesn't mean that this is the culture that you most closely identify with, because you can also move, obviously, and your parents can move. And if you live in several countries, as we now know many people do or have been, that really makes things even more complex, because now you have to ask yourself, okay, what culture do you most closely identify with? I mean, yeah, looking at the country where you spent the most amount of time in is certainly helpful. It's a proxy, but it's not necessarily the right answer. So that's only something that you can figure out for yourself. So if you live 5 years here and 5 years there and 5 years there, which is the culture identity that you most can relate to as an individual first, and then as an employee. But as an employee, it gets even more complex, because of course you have, like you were saying, these large companies, multinational companies, and a lot of them are American, and a lot of them, impose this, well, maybe impose is the wrong word, but they embrace this very American organizational work culture, very like professional, and we use first name on a first name basis, with everybody. It doesn't matter if you're CEO or not, things like that, which I find very endearing, but might come across as very different, let's say, to employees in different countries where you have that large power distance. Like, I feel very uncomfortable. I have students who feel very uncomfortable just calling me John. Now, to be fair, there's very few of them, but most of them feel very comfortable. But there's some that say, no, I feel very uncomfortable because it's not, in my culture, that's not how you do it. So they always use the full title, and I'm like, it's a little bit, seems a bit strange to me at this stage, but that's fine. So if that's what works for them, that's what works for them. And so it's these small differences, but that just add up, and you find yourself every once in a while, like, how much can I actually relate to my leader? And the question doesn't usually pop into your mind, maybe this is about culture. And so, when we were working on this paper where we looked at culture, we ran the study first in Greece, and it worked as expected. Then we ran the study in the US, and the results were very different. Now, they were still consistent, but they were very different. And so I was a little bit lost for words. This was, my work during my PhD, and, like, you have to finish, right? There's a deadline. So, like, we need to get this out. And the results were confusing. So I was having a conversation with, now my wife, and she was like, well, maybe it's culture. And I was like, oh, please don't let it be culture, because it's so complicated, right? It gets really messy very quickly. But she was absolutely right, as she is with most things. Yes, it was culture. Because we ran the study in India, and then we had these 3 very different countries. And we found that the cultural norms, how individualistic you're expected to behave, how collectivistic you're expected to behave, certainly has an influence on whether or not you're going to engage in this transference of past relationships to new relationships. So it's complex, it's messy, but it's a lot of fun as well. So I think as an individual, if you have some idea as to what is the culture I relate to most, and that can change over your lifetime, I think it will if you keep moving around, then that is something that will hopefully be helpful in helping you understand your own perceptions of others, be it leaders or be it anybody else, really. So it's a lot about self-awareness, is what I'm trying to say.
And also, I guess, about your direct reports awareness as well, because if they come from, if they themselves are maybe, because we get a lot of people from different countries, obviously, especially given we were previously part of the European Union, but that's a different conversation. But there's a lot of people that come, and I work with a lot of finance teams where they'll have somebody from Poland, somebody from Germany, from France, that have just come over to the UK. So I guess one of the big shout outs for those, particularly those coming in perhaps to a new role, is to understand their direct reports and what culture they most identify with as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So whatever information you can get ahead of time, or even at the very beginning, once you start a new role, because you can't always get all the information ahead of time, then that's very, very useful. And you should really take your time and interpret and really try to digest that information. Try to understand, what does this mean for the other person. Like, try to understand their viewpoint. Okay, so they come from this culture. It doesn't mean they automatically think like the average citizen. Average means statistically the average, whatever the average is, perception of what a leader should be like. They might have a very, very different idea of what a leader should be like because they live, let's say that person is German, right? And then they live, 10 years in Brazil, and then, 4 or 5 years in the US. It's going to be a very different idea of what a leader is. I can almost guarantee you, right? So this person might not come across as very German in terms of their expectations and their perceptions of things. So it really depends on not so much, what's your passport, right? Where do you come from, but rather what do you identify with the most in terms of a culture. Yeah.
And we've talked a lot about almost a follower's expectation of a leader, but are there different kind of types of relationships between leaders and followers that we can talk about?
Yeah, so the most traditional way of thinking about leaders and followers, especially as a leader, is I want my followers to follow me. Like, that's the bare minimum. This is what I want, right? So actually, when you're saying this, essentially what you're saying is you want passive followers. You want people to go along with your opinions. You want people to agree with you. And that is not the type of follower that I like to encourage my students to be. And I say, I teach leadership and to executives and to undergrads, and it's always like, well, how can you be a better leader? Well, in order for you to be a better leader, you have to first understand how to be a better follower, because what people tend to forget is you're a leader, sure, but you're also a follower. Like, usually you have somebody that you report, right? Even if you're at the very, very top of the organization, you still report to a board. So there's still going to be somebody that, checks in and follows up, to some degree, less and less regular as you move up the hierarchy, but it's nonetheless there. So if you want to understand how to be a better leader, first understand, how to be a better follower. So leadership through followership. Okay. So the best follower that I encourage, my students and anyone that's willing to listen, to be is an active follower. And an active follower is somebody who, sure, they will go along with what the leader thinks is right when they agree, but also they will speak up against the leader and say, no, I don't think that's a good idea, because, reason A, reason B, C, and so on. But that requires a different caliber of a follower, right? Because going along is relatively easy. Being passive, I mean, it's in the word itself, right? You just passive, just don't do anything, and everything will be working itself out. But the active follower is really the one that takes on the risk and thinks about what is about to be implemented, from the top down, and thinks about how does this affect me and how does this affect everybody else that works with me and for me. Does this work or does it not? Does it need an adjustment? And then we get to the conversation on psychological safety, and do people actually feel like they can speak up at work? Will they not be punished for doing so? Is it a very toxic culture, organizational culture? And all of these variables then flow into this. But if you have somebody that speaks up nonetheless, that's really the follower that you ought to embrace as a leader. That's the person that will create, more followers, that will inspire other people to go with your leadership, to go with your decision making. So bringing these people in very quickly, fairly quickly, identifying who they are, and then bringing them into the conversation and making a more democratic, participative leadership. Most of the time, in most industries, this is what will be seen as, favorable outcome. In some industries, this doesn't work, right? So you have very, very like rigid industries where you think about the military, right? That will never happen. So because it's not designed to work like that. So you cannot have soldiers refusing to implement commands, because the whole structure starts falling apart. And then there's other settings as well. When you think of like medical settings, like in the surgery room, right? There's not going to be a debate on how things are. There's not going to be a discussion, but it's going to be the head surgeon, and things will work out in the way they want it to work. That's the process they follow. They dictate what music will be playing in the room, like all of these small decisions. But this is very much a rigid kind of structure. But in most organization contexts, we don't have that. So we do see that when a follower speaks up, when a follower disagrees actively, but for good reason, not just because I don't like you. I don't see you as a leader, so I'm going to say no. That's obviously very silly. But if you do have adequate reasons, then I do think that you should bring these to the relevant person's attention, and that relevant person, that leader, should not be dismissive. And if they are dismissive, then that really showcases that they are more insecure about what they're about to implement, what they want to see, rather than somebody that has a high degree of self-awareness and can say, okay, so this is criticism. I'm going to take that on board, and we're actually going to implement some of those. We're going to look at some of those decisions to be implemented and re-examine them. But really do that, not just to say something like, I'll consider that, and then just do what you had planned. So the best follower to be is an active follower, and that includes speaking your mind when you think things are not as they should be. And the leader should really embrace that, a good leader at least.
So that's a really interesting comment there, that actually embracing not the conflict, but almost embracing that feedback loop piece, which is something almost, I think some leaders actually, dread the conversation where people speak up and say, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
So what other signs are there of a good leader-follower relationship? You talked about both the ability for somebody to speak up,
yep,
and for that to be receptive and to be acknowledged and thought about and considered versus etc. Are there any other signs that people should look at when they're almost analyzing their own leader-follower relationships?
I mean, the very a very easy kind of task or question to ask yourself is who is the person that you go to for advice? Like, who is the person that you trust? And if you don't immediately think, like in a work context, right? If you don't immediately think of your supervisor or the team leader, then it's not that person. It's that easy. So it must be somebody else, right? So if I tell you, okay, think about your workplace, think about all the people that you interact with on a daily basis, a regular basis, who do you go to for advice, for support, for guidance, and for mentorship even, right? And I think it's a very bad idea for your leader to be your mentor, by the way, as well, because it's not a powerless relationship. They have power over you, They can demand that you submit, your work on time and things like that. So that really messes up what a mentee-mentor relationship should be about. So having a mentor outside of the workplace, or at the very least having a mentor outside of your team and maybe even your department, that can certainly work. But having your leader, like your direct report as a mentor, is very, very questionable, I'd say, in the long run. So who do you go to for advice, for guidance? And oftentimes it's not your leader, but oftentimes it is somebody on that level who has a lot of experience in the firm, and but it's not your direct report. And I think that's because oftentimes this piece about mentorship comes in here too. Like, there is no reason why this other person who's not my leader might want to see me fail, and so I'm going to go to that person. Versus my leader, depending on how what kind of relationship it is, might be a very toxic relationship. You're going to be very, very conscious and probably even afraid to go to this person, and rightly so, because past behavior has shown that your leader tends to throw you under the bus whenever is, I mean, figuratively speaking, obviously, whenever is relevant for them, whenever it makes sense for them. And then we get into this these relationship between followers and particular types of leaders, like narcissistic leaders, for example, that are quite prevalent in organizations because of the way that these type of individuals tend to rise to leadership positions. So yeah, it gets more and more complicated. But I always like to say, if behavior were easy, I'd be out of a job. So it's really good that it's complicated. We'll have lots of things to research and talk about for many years to come. So yeah.
No, absolutely. And to be honest, I think that we've gone slightly off from what we originally talked about in terms of topic, but it's been fascinating. So the one thing I just do want to pick up, because I thought it was a really interesting comment, is you said that leaders and mentors are very different things. Yeah. So could you explain to us what is the difference between a leader and a mentor? I think that's a really interesting concept.
Yeah. So the reason why I say this is, like I explained, earlier with regard to just the power imbalance. So we tend to use these words, leaders, leadership. What is a leader? Quite loosely. And so most of the time, what we're referring to in the workplace are managers. We are not actually referring to leaders. We're referring to managers. And like I was saying earlier, just because you're a manager doesn't make you a leader. So that's not even a minimum criteria to be a leader. You don't have to be a manager. You don't have to have power over people. Leadership, I always define leadership as influence. So if you can influence others towards a common goal, then that's leadership. You don't have to be a manager for that. The difference between a leader in the sense that we use it, which is actually referring to a manager, and a mentor, is frankly quite drastic, because a manager, what does a manager do? A manager maintains processes, updates policies, implements decisions. Managers are very much required in organizations. I'm not saying that we don't need managers. Managers very much are needed, because without managers, nothing will get done, right? So managers are needed. But is the manager somebody that you will go to for career advice, for things like, could you actually speak openly to your manager and say, in 5 to 10 years time, I want to be somewhere else. I don't want to be in this organization. I don't think you would ever say that. So because it's, no, it's like the equivalent of saying during an interview, where do you see yourself in 5 years time? Well, I would be so out of here, in 5 years. Like, no one would say that, right? Even if that's your God's honest truth, right? So the difference between a manager and a mentor is, a mentor is somebody you can trust. It's somebody that is usually much, much older than yourself, much more established, somebody who has maybe even reaching the end of their career, and so they have nothing to lose. Like, there's nothing for them to be gained from seeing you fail, except for, of course, like if they're very like Machiavellian or something, they really get a kick out of this. But there's very, very few individuals, luckily, that are like that. So that's the positive news. So a mentor is somebody that you can go to for all kinds of advice and questions. I've been thinking about this problem. It's nothing really concrete. It's not like a data problem or something, but I've been wondering, what would one do in a type of situation like, when you're up for promotion? What are some of the things that to watch out for? I'm not sure if I will go to my manager for that. and expect them to actually give me the answer or be able to tell me from their experience. Now, you might be very lucky and you might have a very positive relationship to your manager, but I would say if you look at the data, most people, when you ask them who's your mentor, they refer to somebody who's either outside the organization or outside of their team because of this lack of a power balance. So power imbalance, apologies. So this is a person that's very established in their career. They might see themselves in you, all right, and that might make them, very open to helping you, and at the very least having a conversation. And a mentor is not somebody that will necessarily tell you, here's what you need to do. Well, they can't do that because they have similar experience. They come from the same similar background. But it is certainly somebody who can say, well, this is what happened to me. Let me tell you a story. And they tell the story, and then it's up to you to make sense of that and think about, okay, how does this apply to me? And most of the time, when it is something that not necessarily they did right, but something they did wrong, so they have to be open to being able to share that with you as well. Like, here's a moment where I messed up, right? And I think you can learn from that. So that's what I'm telling you. Again, I don't think many managers would do that. But again, in terms of when I say the data shows, that doesn't mean that there aren't managers that are not seen as mentors. Of course, they can be. But most of them, like the vast majority of them, like over 90% of them, of individuals say their mentor is somebody outside their team, at the very least outside their team. So that includes their manager. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So I'm very aware that we're rapidly running out of time here, and I really do feel like I could ask you questions about leadership all day. I won't, I promise. But it's been absolutely fascinating. I can imagine you have your students enthralled in your courses. But just because obviously the topic that we have very much covered today is all about how do you build and develop the right kind of leader-follower relationships. How do you set yourself up for success as either a new leader or a leader already in the team? So what are your top tips for doing that, for being both seen as a strong leader by both your obviously your direct reports, the people that you are leading, but also as being as a strong member of the team from the people that you report into?
Yeah, so I would say maybe the three most important aspects that we touched upon today, increase your self-awareness. And that's not something that you're ever done with. So it's not like reach 100%, you're done now. I never have to do that again. No, so it's a continuous process. So try to, at the very least, continuously increase your self-awareness. And, as you gain more experience as a leader, as you gain more experience as a follower, because remember, you're always a follower of somebody. That's very, very important. The second aspect I would say is encourage active followership. Don't be discouraged by people that tell you, I don't think that's a good idea. Or, I've been in your company for 10 years, you've just come in, and so you don't really know how things work around here. Don't see it as judgment. Don't see it as, negative feedback, but see it as something that this is your opportunity to learn, and this is your opportunity to encourage your followers to take a more active role, which also helps you because frankly, they're taking on more of the responsibility, which is what you want. You should want not just to delegate certain aspects of a task that you don't want to do yourself, but rather delegate responsibility, share responsibility. So creating this team climate of, perhaps you can even say shared leadership to some degree. So encourage active followership. And then lastly, I would say, do your homework, get information when, even if you think you've got it all figured out, chances are you probably don't. So try to get more information about who is it that you're leading, who is it that was leading them before you, and what are the kind of characteristics that they would use to describe their past leader-follower relationship. Try to identify that either from them directly, having that conversation, or indirectly through other people that might know your team members. Do your homework, get that information, interpret it, and try your very best to address it. And when you address it, do speak honestly and directly with them. Don't beat around the bush, really go for it. And make a commitment that you are going to do better. And I don't mean just let's do better, like a New Year resolution, but those things that fall apart after 3 weeks, but rather things like, here's how we're going to do better. So I'm going to address this first point, second, third, fourth. Your prior manager maybe didn't really take the time to do regular team meetings. That's going to change, right? That's something very concrete that you can change. More one-on-ones, that's something that during the pandemic, especially, it's something that we've lost. We've lost this, walking down the corridor in the office and just popping into people's office like, hey, how's it going, right? And that's a one-on-one actually. Now it's an official meeting on Teams or on Zoom, but that's very much required because you need to show presence and you need to show that you care as a leader. And the best way to do that is, of course, to check in on your employees, not with something that they need to do, but rather, hey, how's it going? Because I care enough to ask you this question because I genuinely care about making sure that you are actually keeping well and that things are okay. And is there something that I can do to make your work life a little bit easier? So sorry, that was a very bit long, but essentially it's 3 points. So yeah.
No, that's brilliant. And I think for any of those leaders out there listening, I've certainly learned a lot about how leaders can behave in a way that actually drives it. And I was also fascinated to understand about both the global differences, but also about the impacts that when you're going into a new role that you can have both, by what is said before you even go into it. It's amazing to learn about that perception piece. So thank you so much, Jon. I'm hoping that all of our listeners, and I'm sure they have gotten as much out of it as I have. It's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today. Oh,
likewise. Thank you so much, Hannah, for having me.
So if people want to learn more about obviously your research and the work that your university is doing, what's the best, or perhaps even just about leaders and followers and building those strong relationships, what's the best place for them to go? What resources can you recommend?
So I will provide a couple of links with regard to culture and how culture impacts leadership, and I'll put those maybe in the show notes, and also include a link to my university website. And otherwise, for any other type of questions, always feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, just Jon Gruda, Jon. You'll find me and connect with me and just ask away, basically, and we'll keep the conversation going.
Brilliant. And for those that would like to, I'll pop in a link as well to Jon's profile. Yep. So, and it's he's been an amazing source of information. So I certainly will be keeping a close eye. So thank you again, Jon. And and to all of our listeners, I'm sure you will join me in saying a massive thank you to Jon for his insight today. It's been really fascinating.
Thanks so much for having me, Hannah.